If you want to get a FAANG interview, don't just grind leak code. Way too many folks offer that advice, and it's certainly not the best way to get your foot in the door or even pass the interview. Instead, today we're going to talk about a more viable strategy for approaching interview prep to skew the odds way more in your favor so you can enjoy that sweet, sweet tech salary as well. So let's dive in. Firstly, let's start with our strategy. What do we need to land you a job? We need to make sure that you get good, that you get your interview, and that you ace your interview. Now let's break each one of these down. Firstly, getting good. You don't have to be the best engineer, but you certainly can't be a bad one. These big tech companies attract the best talent, so they definitely know if you're telling the truth or not. On the flip side though, some people think you need to be completely perfect in order to land one of these roles, but that's not quite true. You just need to be able to recognize your strengths and have the confidence to broadcast them. Next up, getting an interview. You can be this amazing engineer, but if you're not landing any interviews, you just don't have a shot of getting into the company. Unfortunately, this one has a bit of a luck component to it. So many people don't think too hard about increasing their chances, but there are actually a few things that you can control, and we'll discuss those. And last but not least, acing your interview. Even if you can land all these interviews, if you're not acing them or capitalizing on the opportunity, it's all for nothing. I've also put together a FAANG interview starter kit, which you can download for free below, which gives some extra resources and goodies that accompany this video. All right, so let's start with getting good. Let me just caveat this by saying when you want to interview, you're gonna need at least basic technical proficiency. There is no getting around that. But too many people think you need to be absolutely perfect before you can even apply. I think a lot of folks get overwhelmed thinking about all the different areas they need to optimize and prioritize. So to help think about where to use your time, you can think of a SWE iron triangle. I have no idea if that's gonna look good in post, but you might as well hit subscribe now before I become famous to say you were here first. So getting back to it, the concept of an iron triangle is also known as a triple constraint. It's basically the idea that you often can't have everything. Often there are usually 3 competing attributes, and it's impossible or prohibitively expensive to optimize all 3 at once. For example, a project can be good and fast, but then it's very hard to make it cheap. If you want to make a project cheap and fast, then it's very hard to make it quality. So then what are the constraints on a SWE iron triangle? It looks something like this. We have grades, portfolio, and work experience. So breaking those down, work experience is probably the most important one. This involves any technical jobs or roles you've had in the past. Typically, this speaks the most about your technical ability because you already had to acquire so many skills in order to perform that role. Don't worry if you haven't got any technical experience though. I landed my role with 0 real technical experience. The next one is grades. So this is academic proficiency. It can be certifications, college degrees, anything like that. A lot of people think grades are pretty useless, but it does demonstrate a work ethic. It shows the employer that you're able to work consistently and at certain projects for a long amount of time. And finally, projects. This can include personal websites or larger projects you worked on at college or university. Essentially, it's a portfolio of real work you've done to help demonstrate to your employer that you've got proficiency in certain areas. And this can be really great. Let's say you're applying for a front-end role and you've got your own personal website. Well, there's tons to talk about there. If you're wondering which of these 3 to focus on, then I'd say generally work experience is the most important, followed by projects and then grades. Basically, real world experience is the top priority here, but it really does come down to you and your circumstances. Like I mentioned, I didn't have any practical work experience because I was so anxious at university about grades that I totally over-indexed on them. But instead of being too worried about it, I broadcast that as a strength and it ended up going pretty well. So figure out what your best areas are, sharpen them, and be confident that you don't need everything maxed out in order to land your role. Next up, getting an interview. Even if you're this amazing engineer, if you're just not getting that first interview or phone screen, you can't get to the next stage. This is where I think a lot of people go wrong by just thinking about grinding leak code and getting their technical skills up. Now, getting an interview is probably the hardest part of this process because it's luck driven. There are thousands and thousands of people applying for these roles all the time. And even if they're not as good as you are probably still caught up in all that noise. So a recruiter might not even see your resume or how good of a fit you might be for this role. So what's the solution here? We need to make you stand out from the rest of the crowd. And you do that by having referrals and a perfect CV. The first one that a lot of people don't think about is getting a referral. So a lot of folks already in industry know about this, but getting a referral is probably the most important thing you can do here. What that means is someone in the company refers you for a role, and this basically makes sure that a recruiter will see your CV. It does not mean you're guaranteed an interview, but it is by far the best way to separate yourself from that sea of resumes and other people competing for that role. If you want a referral, then you need to know people in the company. So get networking. I know it's the most generic advice, but it is so important for helping you progress in your career and for landing a role. If you have no idea where to get started with interviewing, here's a few tips. Contribute to open source projects with FAANG engineers. This also helps build up your project portfolio as well, so it's a bit of a win-win. Head to local tech or industry events in your area. Bonus points if you're still at college because there's heaps always happening on campus. It goes without saying here, but make sure you're leaving a good impression. Have your resume prepared just in case, dress appropriately, and make sure to follow up with recruiters if you meet any. Lastly, you can try to get involved in socials. You can make some cold calls asking for suggestions or advice, but don't go too overboard here because it needs to be useful for the other party as well. Secondly, make sure you've got your perfect resume prepared. Having a well-formatted, efficient resume is a small time investment that has such big returns. You can even find some examples in the starter kit I provide below, but I'll list out the few important points here. Probably the most important optimization is to make sure your resume is one-sided and one page long. This is by far the most important first thing to do, because I think so many people assume that showing all of your experience is super important. Recruiters are seeing thousands of resumes a day, so making sure that you make your resume efficient and short is going to make it much more likely for them to actually read it and pass you on to the next stage. If you need to, you can link to, say, your GitHub, your personal website, but for resumes, less is definitely more. And make sure there are no grammatical errors or mistakes. This should be self-explanatory, but quadruple check your work. Show it to friends, make sure you've read it so many times and that there are 0 errors. Your resume doesn't have to be fancy. Make sure it's efficient with short bulleted items. You can add some color, add some photos and so on, but really it's the content that matters the most. Finally, if you're adding experience, don't say vague things like team player who communicates well. Say something like managed a V team of 10 people who produced a strategy to increase user base by 15%. Something that shows what you achieved while implicitly suggesting all the skills you had as well. So get networking, get your resume up to date, and get out there, try land those interviews. Now we need to ace your interview. With all your referrals and your perfect CV, you're probably going to be rolling in interviews. But you need to make sure you're actually capitalizing on those interviews as well. So how do we actually prepare and do well in interviews? I think the most important thing I want you to remember is that you're not just trying to answer the LeetCode question, you're trying to communicate your value to the employer. It's not just about having the best answer in the fastest time. That doesn't really tell them about how well you're going to fit into the team. Most hiring managers are going to want to hire someone that is technically decent, but exceptional in communication and team skills, as opposed to someone who is technically amazing, but has 0 personability, 0 communication, or is not personable. As a bit of an anecdote, I personally failed a pretty simple question when I was doing my interview round. I couldn't reverse a doubly linked tree or something like that with basic data structures. Instead, I pivoted out of my initial solution, talked about a kind of cheesy, object-oriented way of doing it, and instead tried to demonstrate my problem-solving skills and ability to think under pressure, as opposed to being technically perfect. And that was enough to take me to the next round. So being perfect at LeetCode questions is not a requirement here. So working on LeetCode questions will help you ace your interview, but don't just mindlessly grind them. You need to practice with a bit of a shift towards doing mock interviews. This is where you grab a friend or someone you potentially just networked with and either meet up in person or do a video call where you practice doing LeetCodes together. What you're trying to do is simulate a real technical interview environment. And the goal here is instead to refine a few important skills. Probably the most important skill to refine here is to always be chatting and communicating your thought processes. Chatting while coding can actually be pretty difficult. So it's so important to actually practice it so you're not just doing it for the first time when you're in your real interview. Even if you think it's a bit redundant to be talking the whole time, your interviewer is going to appreciate understanding what you're thinking the whole time. And if you are stuck and you can't think of anything, ask clarifying questions. It's so much better to ask for that little bit of help and then show the interviewer you're able to continue and solve the problem with a prompt than it is just to sit there and have no idea what to do or how to go forward. You also want to practice to solve problems under pressure. Sometimes there are these LeetCode questions that just throw you off a bit. So making sure that you're practicing will allow you to refine your problem-solving skills so that you can get unstuck when you're in an actual interview. You also want to practice pseudocoding and writing physically on a whiteboard or paper. It can be pretty weird to be writing code by hand instead of at an editor. So again, get that practice in, get those reps so you're building that confidence for the real thing. Also, while you're practicing, make sure to take turns being the interviewer and interviewee. It's actually really good to be on the other side to understand how you might critique and view someone actually answering the question so that you're able to introspect and think about your own performance from the perspective of the interviewer. So do those mock interviews, get that confidence, and you'll be acing interviews in no time. So equipped with all this knowledge, you're now in a way better place to be acing and preparing for your technical interview. You've now got techniques for increasing your chances of getting an interview, and even more importantly, to broadcast your skills, communicate your value to an employer, and have great interview skill as well. So now that you're probably going to be a FAANG engineer soon, why don't you check the next video where I talk about how to increase your impact as an engineer. See you in the next one.